let's talk about this. So people, if they want to start to engage and to see what the chances are for the Democrats to hold the Senate, and look, again, Cliff, I think we've talked about this, but the relevance of holding the Senate, we're
Is
talking about Supreme Court
go ahead.
justices, we're talking about judge appointments, we're talking about cabinet appointments, we're talking about
Regulatory officers
that.
of
I
any
think is even
sort.
bigger. Like things like the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. These sort of independent agencies, the National Labor Relations Board,
Spend
these are
time wasted on hearings over every dumb thing they can dream up.
the hearings, but they can actually strip a lot of the regulatory agencies of their funding. They can, they can chip away at this stuff. And then there's on the flip side of that, there are things that President Obama wants to do that none of us want him to do. And a
Yes.
Republican Senate may very well, including the House, which is going to move to the right, it looks like, and may have a governing majority. In other words, much easier for them to pass things with just Republicans. Um,
Right. The
things like
irony of this all might be that we may have to, like we had to with the grand bargain, quote unquote, rely on the wingnut strategy, which is that enough people on the far right will not vote for something because it means actually, voting for something that a black man supports. So, or that's something that's going to bring us one world government where the UN will take over all of our golf courses.
right, I'm talking
So,
about we're talking about the TPP and the TTIP.
right, that so they wouldn't vote against it because, let's say, it hurts workers or the environment or anything like that. They would not vote for it because of some trumped up, Ted Cruz type crazy theory. And in the end, that's the only we'd have to rely on that insanity to stop it. Because again, as we've talked about, President Obama, he has things he wants to get done, and to him, passing legislation is worth it, as we saw with that, for example, that compromise on the judges, as we've seen with that one terrible judge, Boggs, who thankfully was eventually blocked, as we've seen, on the grand bargain, other stuff like that. He's perfectly willing to vote for stuff that a minority of a minority in this country supports, if the Republicans push it on him. If that means he can get one or two things out of it he likes.
Right. All right. So with that said, give us a sense of what's going on. There are 6 states that the Republicans are looking to take from Democratic either incumbents or a vacated seat: Louisiana, Arkansas, Alaska, Montana, South Dakota, and West Virginia.
Yep.
What's happening with those 6 states?
Well, first, let's say it looks like now that 2 states that originally targeted, North Carolina and Michigan, Democrats are doing very well and are relatively far ahead, have run good campaigns, and the Republicans have been very flawed. It's not to say any of that's over yet, but it looks like those 2 are off. And there's 2 others we'll talk about in a second that are really more challenging right now. But of those 6, what you've had is you've got 3 open seats that where Democrats have left. West Virginia, they've got the Secretary of State. Her race hasn't seemed to catch much fire, and what's her name? Shelley Moore Capito,
Right.
daughter of a former governor there, in a trending Republican state. It looks like that's not a good situation for us. Montana, I don't think there's a progressive running there who's never really gotten the resources, and after that whole mess of the John Walsh pulling out because of plagiarism, has hurt there. One of the important ones that I like to talk about, and I think it's important to talk about, is what's going on in South Dakota, where essentially, a friend of mine and maybe of yours who writes for, runs his own blog, Down with Tyranny, Howie Klein, who isn't really afraid of anybody and writes about things as he sees them and as he talks to insiders. He's been writing about this for a while, and it's now been in the Hill and other places, which is, Harry Reid originally wanted the candidate there to be Stephanie Herseth Sandlin, who was in the House and was asked, he was as blue dog as blue dog gets. That's who he wanted. But Rick Weiland decided to run, who's a former aide of Tom Daschle's, and is a progressive populist in all the best sense of that phrase.
I actually interviewed him at Netroots Nation, but we had technical difficulties. I was never able to run the interview. And, the guy sat down. I hadn't even heard much about him. And I generally am a little hesitant to just talk to candidates running because it's usually not a terribly interesting interview. But this guy was pretty good, I got to say.
Yeah, he's good, and he's got some experience, and it seems like a smart guy. And of course, Daschle, through his support behind him, and I'm not sitting here saying that Daschle's the most wonderful guy in the world because we could talk about Tom Daschle's lobbying, but we're not going to because that would take up. I'm just saying in this case, Daschle did the right thing, and through his support behind Weiland and others, well, Harry Reid was miffed because Stephanie Herseth-Sandlin wanted to have it handed over to her, didn't want to run in a primary, and especially against somebody progressive who might force her to talk about how much of a blue dog she is on certain issues. So she dropped out. And because it seems Harry Reid has been personally peeved about that, it seems like he might actually be willing to give up the Democrats controlling the Senate because he's annoyed, which is just incredible. I mean, when you look at some of these races and some of the things that go on, you often think that these people are better than that, and that they can put aside personal differences to do, especially if they're going to be the majority leader. But he's come out and actually said, oh, we're going to lose South Dakota, the DSCC, which still sort of, he controls it at least, even if Michael Bennett from Colorado controls it nominally. They're not going to do anything Harry doesn't want them to do, has given no support to Weiland. And Mike Rounds, who's the incumbent governor, is in this huge scandal over there of handing out visas, for money.
We should say, okay, here's the deal. Now, Rounds. Now, the only the argument that the Democrats in Washington say, look, we've seen the internal polls. Weiland doesn't have a chance of winning. It would be a waste of money. But there's a couple of things to note before we get to what's going on with Mike Rounds. Mike Rounds is the sitting governor who's running for Senate. He's leading with 35%. This is the most recent public policy polling. He's got 35%. Weiland's got 28%. An independent, Larry Pressler's got 24%.
Who's sort of a former Republican senator, but one of the moderates, an actual moderate from when there used to be those, who endorsed Obama for president twice. So, he falls in that kind of middle ground area.
And the presumption is that guy would caucus with the Republicans, or nobody knows?
That's a great question. I don't know what the assumption is with Pressler, which way he would, I mean, his politics are probably similar to an Orman or an Andrew or an Angus King, as a moderate kind of, frankly, even like a Joe Manchin. So, who knows what he would do in the end. I don't think I've ever heard that talked about. But in the end, look, you're looking at a situation here. I'm sure some Republicans, I haven't seen the analysis, are not voting for Rounds because he's so right wing and because he's basically a scumbag and has been involved in these scandals. So they're going with Pressler. And you've got Weiland, who, polls are showing to be as close as some of the other people who the DSCC, at least at times, has put major money behind. I mean, you have to remember initially they were supporting, the right-wing Democrat in Mississippi against Thad Cochran. I think they finally maybe were disabused of that notion. The former congressman down there at Childers, but they've been, they've done that, and they put money into some other races. So the fact that this guy has gotten no money, no support, nothing, and is only down 7 points. I mean,
and people should remember that a dollar spent in South Dakota versus a dollar spent in, let's say, well, probably just about anywhere else. Goes a long way. I mean, this is a very small media market. You can, for a very small amount of money, relatively speaking, you can make a big splash. And it is...
it just seems crazy to leave that on the table. You're telling me you couldn't put $1 million or $2 million, as you're saying right now, into that state. The turnout operation that they're putting in a bunch of other states that's been lauded. It's for Obama's former turnout operation, where they're saying that it could help Democrats as much as 2 to 3 points, because of what they're doing. You couldn't do that in South Dakota and also maybe put $1 million into ads, pointing out the scandal that is Mike Rounds. It just seems, it's incredible to me. And this isn't just some conspiracy theory. Again, now the mainstream media has picked this up. It's been reported that these two guys, and frankly, it said, Harry Reid's chairman insulted Daschle in this article, and so it's clear that this feud really is going on. It's not some made up thing. And it's just incredible to me. And actually, if you read in one of the other races where the DSCC has gotten on board, but where it's clear that they do try to pick their horses, which I don't think anybody doubts, but if you want more evidence, where Sam Nunn has said that his daughter, if she's elected, if Michelle Nunn's elected, will not need to support Harry Reid, because Harry Reid tried to get her out of the race for another blue dog, John Barra, who literally is the most right-wing House member of all of them. Of every not of all of them, of every Democrat in the House, he is the most right-wing. And so they didn't want Michelle Nunn. They wanted this guy instead. Even if Michelle Nunn is not your cup of tea, she's kind of a moderate, or maybe, whatever she is.
For Georgia, right.
Right, but she's certainly not as conservative as Barrow. And Sam Nunn says that, he came out and basically insulted Harry Reid too, and said this. So clearly this has gone on. And I mean, it's just infuriating. Because obviously there's new opportunities that popped up, like the one in Kansas, where you've got the independent on the ballot. The courts just the other day said there doesn't need to be a Democrat. He's leading by 46-41, which is amazing that Roberts is only at 41. He's very personally wealthy, so he can put his own money into this thing. And Kansas actually looks like a very solid potential pickup opportunity, which is amazing. Again, Orman's not the kind of Democrat that Weiland is, for that matter. He's not progressive the way he is, but he's for background checks and immigration reform, and wants to get rid of Citizens United, and is pro-choice, and all of those things from Kansas are remarkable, frankly. So you got that, but right now, we're in a position where we're actually losing by a little bit, or tied at best, in Iowa and Colorado, which are both purple states.
Yep.
And it makes you wonder, and say to yourself, should we be setting up a firewall and doing a kind of triage strategy? I mean, Mark Pryor and Mary Landrieu are both against flawed opponents. They can handle it. It's either going to happen or it's not going to happen. It looks like a lot of people are getting involved spending in Colorado and Iowa, but my God, I mean, we've got in both those places. In Iowa, we have a progressive, in Colorado.
Bruce Braley, and we should just tell people that, Bruce Braley, a pretty good populist in the House, who just made a mistake of mocking
farmers, which is a relatively big mistake in Iowa.
Right.
On videotape. It is,
he didn't mock farmers. He mocked the sitting senator.
But he said you want a lawyer sitting on the judiciary, not a farmer.
Right.
And he said something negative about the fact that Grassley was a farmer, which in Iowa, it's like if you were saying you don't want a Mormon sitting there in Utah. That probably wouldn't help you, right? So. You've got a situation where Braley has not run the best campaign. He's also had one or two other gaffes, but he would be a really good senator from his past record. And I just feel like you got to do everything in your power to get those two over the top in those two states. And so, that's really the situation right now. Because if they win those 6 seats, and the Democrats were to just win Kansas, then the Democrats would still have control. If Orman, and I should say the independent one, if Orman decided to caucus with the Democrats. Well, it would seem he'd be more comfortable, as the Republicans are attacking with everything they've got right now, but is not guaranteed. And then you have Kentucky and Georgia, which are potential pickup opportunities. So that's where the math of it is right now. But if they were to also take, Colorado and Iowa, then you're looking at a situation. Well, then you need 2 more seats, and is that Kentucky and Georgia? Wouldn't you want to add South Dakota to the potentials where you could win?
Right.
Particularly from our perspective, a very progressive populist in Weiland. It's a mess right now in the last month. It's pretty hard to tell. It could go either way.